ready to get started? Yeah, or you are Ash on Zoom.
Yep.
Hey. Hi, everyone. The Community Advisory on Public Safety Commission is proud to welcome you to this panel discussion following the screening of Reimagining Safety, documentary film created by Matthew Solomon. We're honored to be joined by Matthew in person today, and we hope that if you missed the screening yesterday, that you will stream his film on Amazon. When we published our alternative public safety report last year, we received very strong support from local community safety providers and social justice leaders. Our recommendation for a Department of Community Safety and Resilience to prioritize meeting the basic safety needs of all residents in the city is one that we are currently still working towards. Safety for all at the expense of none was the subtitle of that report. And that phrase encapsulates many of the trade-offs that are made between protecting the safety interests of some people that come at the expense of other people's safety, which are rampant in our current public safety system that are highlighted both in film and in our report. After receiving support from the local providers of community safety for our recommendations, our commission decided to focus next on reaching out to the Indiana University campus. We are delighted to have been selected by IU Cinema as a recipient of their screen share program that allows community organizations to highlight films about issues that impact us locally. In choosing a film, our commission reached out to the National Scholar of Policing and Justice, Alex Vitale, who stars prominently in the film and who has consulted with our commission in its work. We were thrilled to learn about the film Reimagining Safety that overlaps so well with our report and our local recommendations. So Alex put us in touch with Matthew and several of the local scholars and experts of community safety and policing to join us here today. We are deeply indebted to IU Cinema, the IU School of Public Health's Office of Public Health Practice, and to Alex Vitale for making this event possible. Besides highlighting Matthew's film and facilitating conversation in our community on positive changes that can be made in the public safety system, one of the main goals of these events this weekend is to build a coalition of organizations and individuals who share our commission's goal of improving public safety for all residents of our community. That goal has been met and exceeded in the organizations who offered to co-sponsor and produce these events, including the IU School of Public Health's Office of Public Health Practice, the Indiana Recovery Alliance, New Leaf, New Life, Care Not Cages, Monroe County Women's Commission, and the Palestine Solidarity Committee at IU. We are thrilled to host this panel of local and national experts in community safety. First, two panelists are here from our local co-sponsors, Jordan McIntyre of New Leaf, New Life, and Nick Boyles of Indiana Recovery Alliance. We're also joined by regional and national experts in policing and social justice, including film director Matthew Solomon, Dr. Jody Armour, online professor of law at University of Southern California, who stars in the film, Dr. Max Felker Cantor, professor of history at Ball State University, and Amber Sherman, a Black liberation organizer and podcaster from Memphis, Tennessee. Many of us here today have either been directly harmed or failed by the public safety system, or have loved ones who have been harmed or failed by the system. Some of the event sponsors and panelists work with people on a daily basis who are left behind or left worse off by their experience with our existing system. What we all have in common in doing this work is that we care about the individuals who are the most vulnerable and the least safe in our community. Furthermore, we know that individuals are not the problem and that system change is needed. Our commission's approach to community safety takes such a systems level approach. And I highly encourage everyone attending these events this weekend to help our commission set the agenda for the future of safety in Bloomington by joining the Bloomington Community Safety Roundtable, which is linked on our commission website and in the printed playbill, who will be composed of individuals and organizations meeting every few months with our commission to help us develop our recommendations going forward. We know that system change is an immense task that will require all of us here in this room participating in it to get it done. Finally, I want to let everyone know that the film is currently available for watching on YouTube, Tubi, Google Play, and Amazon. Matthew would like to request everyone send their friends to see the film on Amazon and leave it a review there to help him improve the distribution for this important film. Without further ado, from everyone at the CAPS Commission, thank you to IU Cinema and all of you for attending this panel today. And we hope this panel discussion will help contribute towards making Bloomington a safer community. I now have the great pleasure of introducing CAPS Commission Co-Chair and my close friend, Kamala Brown Sparks. Kamala is a local community activist and educator whose roots in the public safety system of Bloomington run deep. Please welcome Cami for a brief message before our panel discussion begins.
Welcome to this afternoon's event, Reimagining Safety, by the Community Advisory on Public Safety. I'm Kamala Brown Sparks, the co-chair of the CAPS Commission. The issue of community safety is something that is very close to my heart. My father was Charles Brown, the first African-American police officer in Bloomington. My mother, Catherine, was a social worker, and I saw how both of their jobs were necessary to make an impact of the issues the citizens of Bloomington were facing. It's impressive to see people doing this on a larger scale and the success they've been having. Please enjoy the panel discussion and participate wholeheartedly. Thank you.
So to kick us off, I'm going to ask our panelists to just go ahead and introduce themselves before we get started with the questions. So we can start at this end.
Sure.
You mind going first?
So I'm Dr. Max Felker-Cantor. I'm an associate professor of history at Ball State University. I guess for the purpose of this panel, I write about policing and anti-police abuse movements in U.S. history. I've written a book titled Policing Los Angeles, Race Resistance and the Rise of the LAPD, which traces LAPD and anti-police abuse movements from the Watts Uprising to the '92 Rebellion. And I have a book coming out in about 4 weeks on the history of the DARE program and police in schools and all of that. And then I'm also working on a book on the history of the Rampart scandal in Los Angeles and corrupt cops.
Nick Boyles, I'm the executive director at the Indiana Recovery Alliance. We deal with most marginalized sections of each group of people there is, I guess you'd say. We deal mostly with drug use and the systemic problems drug use that our society has put on people who use drugs. How to rectify those, change those, or make positive changes in a person's life as best we can under our current system. I've been incarcerated for a very long time, once before, and it wasn't pleasant. And I've dealt with the system since I was 12. So it's a personal thing for me more than anything else.
My name is Amber Sherman. I'm an organizer from Memphis. I mainly do policy and strategic organizing in Memphis, and then also for some like different statewide issue initiatives. Right now I'm working on some like statewide legislation that's pushing back against the reforms we passed in Memphis. So working to like manage a statewide coalition for that.
I'm Matthew Solomon. In addition to being the Director of Reimagining Safety, born and raised in Los Angeles, I grew up with the DARE program and the Rampart scandal. I'm also an adjunct professor at Antioch University, and I was just added to Claremont Lincoln University's faculty pool. I teach conflict resolution, intercultural conflict, and I facilitate conflict resolution as well.
I am Jordan McIntyre. I'm the executive director of New Leaf, New Life, which is a local organization here in Bloomington that works with folks who are incarcerated. In addition to that, I teach here in School of Public Health.
Thank you.
Group therapy.
Hi, I'm Jody Armour. I'm the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law here at the University of Southern California. I focus especially on the back end of this issue. Prison abolition is my primary focus. Police misconduct, however, is a very important issue I grapple with as well. My latest book, In Asterisk GGA Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law, attempts to address a lot of the concerns we're going to be talking about this afternoon. And finally, I started my teaching career at Indiana University in Bloomington at the University of Indiana Law School. So it's good to be back to this community.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. So let's get started. If everyone could keep your questions who are in the audience today. And if you're online participating, please put your questions as they come up in the chat box. We will be taking questions from the audience after I ask the moderator questions. So please, start preparing those. So first question. And I'm just going to ask these generally to all the panelists, and then we can just see who feels like answering. So the first question, the community stakeholders interviewed in our commission's alternative public safety report included many marginalized people, drug treatment providers, police, and the fire department chiefs, and political candidates all widely agreed that the lack of access, drug treatment, and mental health care in our city is an important factor behind recent calls for help to our local emergency services, such as accidental overdose or people experiencing mental health crises. What is the best kind of response to these sorts of calls for help? And how can the city of Bloomington strategically address this lack of capacity in our community? And perhaps we can just kind of go one at a time.
I think what the city of Bloomington could do is invest in a robust harm reduction framework. If we start just there, we could definitely start seeing some unique changes. I think the idea is that people misunderstand what harm reduction is in and of itself, and it's not widely enough known for people to grasp the changes it can make. People are 5 times more likely to enter treatment than enter a syringe service program. People can talk about their drug use in a syringe service program, but they can't anywhere else in the world. They do not feel open enough. And we address a group of people that are unable or unwilling to talk to anybody else. And a lot of times, like I always use this as kind of a frame up, is nationally, this friend of mine had a xylazine poisoning in 2019, and a local group or a national group we all work with threw it out to the world, right? And said, hey, this stuff's in this drug supply. It's horrible. We need to stop it. And no one listened. Now, 5 years later, everybody's screaming xylazine. Whereas had they paid attention to the people who use drugs that were right there at that moment, we would have handled this. We stopped the nation for COVID. We could have thrown a little bit of something into making public awareness made in 2019, and it would have stopped these abysmal scars and lesions and horrible things that happen with a certain additive to an already poisoned or polluted drug supply. So taking harm reduction efforts like drug checking, like, which allows people to test their drugs and find out what's in it. And I don't mean test like walk-in that we can do with residue. We don't need the actual substance to be there, right? Things like syringe service programs, things like what we're looking at now, the harm reduction in housing that doesn't require a person to be sober to be there, right? Housing First kind of works with this intensely. And I think that like if we're looking at people who use drugs, we need to get a robust idea of what they want. Instead of thinking that we know what they want or that we know what they need, they can make decisions for themselves. We need to just provide them whatever mechanisms they need to reach a better place. You know, it's a misnomer that all people who use drugs are liars. It's a misconception that all people who use drugs don't want to be healthy. We do. Just sometimes with the world that we live in, it's hard to think that way when each step you make or the single use of a syringe is a felony, you know, and that's what your day has to look like, right? People talk about discarded syringes. If there was no felony for syringe, you'd hardly ever see a discarded syringe, because why would they want to do that, you know? So, and that's what I would say is that if the city would make a unique and valuable investment in both harm reduction, which does include treatment, right? It does include all many forms of different treatments. MAT, 12-step based abstinence, yes, harm reduction does include that. All sorts of, then we would be looking at the problem for the first time out of the eyes of the drug user instead of the eyes of the administrator or out of the eyes of someone who wants to make money.
Thank you, Nick, for that answer, which really focused on the part of the question of how to reduce the calls for help with accidental overdose particularly. And I really appreciate in your answer that you focused on providing the services that people are requesting, which is a consent-based approach, which our report emphasizes. A consent-based approach is a new community safety approach that we are advocating for, as opposed to the coercive enforce-based approach of traditional policing. So I really appreciated that. Would anyone else like to speak to that question of how to reduce the recent rise in calls to help for things such as accidental overdose or mental health crises?
My automatic answer was also gonna be harm reduction. I think that if governments stopped giving so much money to police and actually gave them to nonprofits or organizations that were doing work to build harm reduction centers, like what they have in Patterson, New Jersey. Bill and Patterson has a harm reduction center, and it's the only one that I know about, where they welcome people in who are dealing with drugs or crisis, and they treat them like human beings. They just this past weekend took them out to the movies and to dinner, and they talked about how, you know, people who do drugs are humans too, right? We can treat them like regular people, and they enjoy, you know, they deserve to have good things just as like, you know, other people do. So I think it's important to put funding into that. Because we see these huge amounts of police budgets. Like I know you mentioned that Bloomington has increased their police budget. But if we took the money that they weren't using for mental health services and gave it to an org to start a harm reduction center, I think that you would see a large decrease in the amount of calls for that.
I'll add just one other thing. When policies are being created, when being enforced, you know, one of the things that often is missing, not among, sure, us here, but you know, it's really centering and amplifying the voices of the people who are most affected by the systems and by policies, and that's something that gets missed a lot of times. And so not only centering, but amplifying. And so if the stakeholders are not including communities and not centering those communities, because it's one thing to, you know, include everybody and then decide, okay, we're going to do this anyway, you know, this thing, but not really taking into account, well, what do the people that are most affected want and need? And let's do that because they're literally telling us what they want and need. So, you know, that's another part of it. And it, you know, it gets talked about in the film. Nikki Black, who's a sociologist from Inglewood, talks about how in a way we're socialized to other people, and it's automatic. We're not always aware of it, but it's super easy to be like, oh, well, you know, that's those people, that's their problem. But it's really our collective responsibility to take care of one another. That's how I see it. So if we really, you know, one of my big takeaways from the film, the process is, if we really cared about one another, we would do things differently. So at every step, we're, creating programs and policies. Is this out of care for these communities, or is it covering our butts or making money or any number of things? So that's what I wanted.
I think part of the answer to that question is right in the question, right? Having issues with lack of access to treatment or mental health care. So obviously we need to have more access to that, right? If there's a lack of it, for the people that want those services. Also with policies, there are a lot of things that we encounter with folks that are incarcerated. If they are at a point where they are ready, they want to go to treatment, that's what they've decided. Insurance comes into play at that point, right? And a lot of treatment centers, insurance will pay as long as their last date of use was within 30 days. So if they're incarcerated for 31 days and they have not used any substances, insurance will not pay to go to treatment afterwards. So there are little policies like that that get in the way. If someone is on medication for mental health care and they're incarcerated, they no longer have access to that medication. So it really impacts stability for some folks and can really kind of throw you into a frenzy, right? If you have medication that you're supposed to take every day and you don't have access to it for even 1 or 2 days, that really can impact your stability. So there are a lot of factors that go into solving these issues.
I would only add, right, to this, at the start of it, is we have to also get ourselves out of a framework of prohibition and policing as like the fundamental response to begin with, right? That we know that police can't solve this, but to get to harm reduction, we have to like start to shift people's assumptions. Drugs and the way that we deal with them is through a policing model, right? And so we've asked the police to solve this so-called war on drugs for decades and decades, and it hasn't worked. And so we have to kind of start to think about shifting away from a prohibition of drugs model that we know leads to kind of greater harm, as well as about like just kind of relying on the police as the entry point into even any of these other services, right? So we've got to, at the very start, that front end of policing needs to kind of be rethought, because I think what a lot of people assume, right, is that that's one of the reasons the police are here, right? Is to deal with these with drugs and drug use on the streets, right? And so we've got to kind of start to rethink that response, right? And what we ask the police to do is a kind of key part of that.
And I'm on the board of an organization called LEAP, Law Enforcement Action Partnership is what they call themselves now, but their original title, a little over 10 years ago, was Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And they are chiefs of police, captains, lieutenants, all the way down to rank and file, national and international now. And their core recognition is that we do not need to approach drug issues using just what was just said, a prohibition model that by all kinds of prohibition fail miserably, have failed from long ago when we were prohibiting alcohol. We were so keen about prohibiting alcohol, we put it in the Constitution. We came up with a constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol and saw that there created so many collateral consequences, unintended consequences, and harms that we had to come up with another constitutional amendment to get rid of prohibition, right? And the police, LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition originally, recognized that the police should not be in the business of going after these kinds of prohibition concerns, because what it does is creates a reservoir of resentment between members of the community and the police department. We're throwing the police out there to solve problems they're not equipped to solve, they're not geared or designed to solve, and so they wind up in a lose-lose situation. So it's fortunate that a good number of law enforcement folk have now recognized that prohibition is just the absolute wrong-headed way to go at these issues.
And they just keep refunneling money towards that, right? Like they know it's a problem. Then they like create all these robust, weird programs to try to like solve the problem. They already know is what the original answer to the problem is. So they'll come up with all these like crazy acronyms for like this program, that program, this program. They're supposed to solve the singular problem that all you have to do is take this out of police care. It's a public health response. It's not a police response. And put it into public health's hands. All right. It's that simple. Unfortunately, like as soon as we open these doors to things like going after doctors and all of these things that took healthcare in the DEA or in the governments, what do they know about any of this? You know what I mean? Like this is not even their purview. And they've changed it so now punishment is the model. So it's just like being on probation, you know, by being a doctor. And these doctors are scared to do good jobs. They're scared to do whatever help because they fear the arm of the law coming down on them. Whereas if we just started from the very beginning and said, wait a minute, this is not in our wheelhouse. We don't have the way to do it. We don't have the power to do it. We're gonna give it to public health. Then we wouldn't be in the situation we are in now. That's also the same with harm reduction that is trying to do a public health response on a nonprofit budget and a nonprofit system, which is not set up to do.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I definitely heard, a good mix of, discussing some of the barriers to access in our community to the safety resources that we all know and acknowledge can solve these problems, as well as the ideological focus that people have, the traditional focus of people where they see someone using drugs or they see a needle somewhere and think, oh, I better call the police. This is what you do. And so thank you for those answers. The next question, despite the work of several local city organizations, including the CAPS Commission and our sponsors, Indiana Recovery Alliance, Care Not Cages, New Leaf New Life, and others who advocate for ending the criminalization of poverty, homelessness, drug use, and mental illness, and using policing and incarceration as a response to these rising social problems, Monroe County is currently working to build a new jail with a larger capacity and expanded services to incarcerate even more local residents. What are national trends telling us about rates of incarceration in the US? And please tell us your thoughts about how building a bigger jail with expanded services is likely to impact our community's safety.
Well, you increase the capacity to incarcerate, you're going to incarcerate more, right? It's fairly simple and straightforward. The way we are approaching, for example, houselessness out here in LA and California is to crack down on the down and out with more criminalization, right? In fact, they're going to the Supreme Court now, liberals as well as conservatives, arguing that we need to be able to lock more houseless people up, because the problem with houselessness they see is not the lack of affordable housing and crumbling schools and inadequate wages, but rather it is broken people suffering from lack of personal responsibility, having personal deficiencies. And so the way to solve that problem is to come down on them with citations and threats of jail, and then send them to houseless shelters where we put them on 12-step programs to solve their inner brokenness, because that's the source of the problem, not our failure as a society to provide adequate, affordable housing. And so we need to come up with a poverty governance model that does not rely on incarceration, but rather recognizes these people as humans, as not otherwise, people with suffering from a lack of personal responsibility, and as our collective responsibility.
Thank you.
I think we should stop being surprised that governments are doing the exact opposite thing of what we ask you to do. Yeah. I feel like there's like this shock and awe of surprise of like, we wrote this great report, or we should put out all this data and you aren't listening to us, but that's what governments were created to do. Like they are tenets of white supremacy who are working towards jailing and killing as many Black people as they can. They have no desire to save a Black life. And so I think that if we continue to push more towards abolition versus trying to get them to listen to a report that we wrote or look at this data, creating those things ourselves, like creating more solidarity economy practices within communities, kind of similar to what Jody was saying, but creating them yourself within your own community and not relying on the government to do it because the government isn't going to do it. And then also creating ways that we push back against the things that they, are doing against us, the pervasive, like, things about the jail and the programming, like, we can push back against that, but also at the same time, creating your own programs, your own resources for your community, because the government and the police aren't gonna do that.
I think even more than that, that it's intentional, like its intentionality needs to be laid bare for people that like we don't suffer under the guise that people are going, oh, we got this system that does this all of a sudden now, gosh darn it. Like these are intentionally laid out plans. Do you know what I mean? Like we can either accept that they're the dumbest people on the face of the planet or that it's intentional. These people are not stupid, you know what I mean? So obviously it's a plan to some end, it's a money churner now, It's like someone once told me if you put a whole bunch of middleman in the business, it'll just run on its own because you'll have to spend so much time getting money to fund the middleman that it just churns and churns and churns. And that's how I look at like some of these issues. It's like there's such a huge level of money put to law enforcement, right? For what? I mean, what is the main thing law enforcement is doing? It's literally locking up mostly brown and Black people, right? I mean, it's literally like the core of what they do, or at least people who use drugs. Or people for non-victimless crimes, the rate of victim crimes and I'm not saying I'm not trying to discuss victim and victimless crimes. There's usually, I've had pushback on that said, there are no victimless crimes, but I'm just saying for what we commonly know as victimless crimes, incarceration is the goal, right? Even if you're simply on probation. I mean, I went through the system my entire life and there was never a point I ever felt they were helping me. They were rehabilitating me, that they cared about me. I mean, it was very, very early on. I realized that there was no care for me whatsoever. You know what I mean? And luckily I had a mother who's pretty smart about that and like agreed with me and helped me process that really early. Right. But like that is damaging for people. When people come out of incarceration, we have someone, a close friend of ours now who's coming back and he's been 16 years in a Florida prison for drugs. Right. So things he had to do to stay alive in that prison. You all say, oh, I would never do that. I'd never do that. Maybe you don't know what you do if you're there. You have no idea. And Black and brown people have had to do this since the inception of this, when there were a lot more white people than Black. I mean, like it's the gladiator. But the point being is that it's set up to create these people that when they come out, they have you've lived a certain set of terms, a certain set of life for 16 years. You have no idea how to live in the real world anymore. There's no reentry that truly helps you, right? I mean, we do great here. Like they are fucking amazing. New Leaf New Life does amazing stuff. Care Not Cages. I mean, the idea that we have that here is unreal. Because mostly you just get out and you're screwed. You go find a job or we bang you back in. And a lot of times people go ahead and go back to prison because it's what they know. At least they're safe, right? That may sound like counterintuitive. You've lived for 16 years incarcerated or 5 years or 10 years or whatever. It happened to me. Like at one point I was like, man, at least if I go back to prison, I know the rules. I know what's where to go. That's statistically sick. And it all stems up from when we were catching slaves back in the day that this whole thing started from. You know what I mean? It's that continuous cranking on the wheel to make you feel like less than human. That's what he said about 12-step programs that always shocks and awes me. It's like the coerciveness of something always has to be looked at. You know what I mean? And it's like some people, this system really works. And I'm super happy that it does. But like the idea of that you're flawed fundamentally, is the same thing they use in race, same thing they use in classism and all those. That you start broken and messed up. And then society has to remanage you, fix you, because whatever you are is fundamentally wrong. So how could we ever be a part of society? Fundamentally fucked up, Yeah.
I think one thing that we always have to say is a jail with treatment's still a jail, right? Indianapolis, where I live, gosh, now I'm gonna get my dates wrong and the historian, right? But 4 or 5 years ago, they built a new jail. And they passed a six or $700 million bond, finance it. And they call it a justice complex, but it's still a jail with treatment. And they're still talking about the problem of quote unquote crime in the city, right? And so we know that these solutions, really what they end up doing is just reinvesting in this sort of broader criminal justice framework, and that builds jail capacity, right? Whether it goes back to the, as Jody was saying at the start, that they'll fill those jails. I was in a city council hearing years ago with that, when one of the city councilors said, well, if we build it, then other counties can send us their prisoners, so that, and for payment, right? So they were seeing it as a model of creating, we have this capacity, right? And we see that with the police too, is they may be invested in seeing these so-called reforms, because often those reforms mean they get more money, right? If you think like, we come back to, I don't know if it's like body cameras or whatever, but they're like, if they control those programs, they're still benefiting from that rather than taking funds away from the police, right? So I think those are kind of the pieces that how I think about this a little bit more, right? Within an abolitionist framework as well, right? That reform often builds the power of these systems.
Adding on to what you were saying about the funds, so we've been traveling around doing screenings of the film, and yesterday was the 41st screening across the country. And I was talking to an activist in Sacramento whose brother was murdered by Sacramento PD. And she now helps families navigate the legal system, with, bringing charges against officers and that sort of thing. And so in her experience, and this happened with several of the families she's been working with, the family gets a settlement. Part of that settlement goes back into policing or training. So the police are benefiting from the settlement, which blew my mind that, it shouldn't at this point, but that the family didn't even get the full like $100 and something thousand. It went back into training. So I want to add that to what Max was saying. And then the other part, I don't know if we're going to get into this, but in addition to building all these jails, like there's all these cop cities that are being built around the country. So, we're building these training facilities and these places to house the people that are going to be locked up as a result. So I just want to add that.
That goes to normalizing.
Yeah.
We're normalizing this in our country now. That Cop City thing blew. I thought it was a joke. Like that, the idea of normalizing abuse by police and that they're fully invested in that. That's what I always think of when they show things like Cop City. Like how much have they fed us that we're now like, we're not burning that thing down as a group right now. We're willing to let it stand.
And then the people that are pushing back,
Of course, that's
RICO charges and all that stuff.
Yeah, RICO charges.
And from what I've heard, there's more than one. City.
Oh, yeah.
They're
Oh, yeah.
making one outside Boston or
It's
East Coast,
popular
as well
now.
as the one in Atlanta. So thank you for those answers. So it sounds like, starting us off, Dr. Armour, our incarceration model is focused on punishing people for their individual failings and their lack of personal responsibility. Again, this is the ideology behind it, rather than taking accountability as a society and saying, this is a failing of our society. We need to change our society's approach. And as you called it, a poverty governance model. Also, thanks to Amber, for giving us a realistic view and not being so hopeful and expecting the government to solve all of our problems. We personally on the CAPS Commission, since we advise the city, we really hope the city of Bloomington is going to step up and help us solve some of these problems. And so we are a bit optimistic in that regard, I would say. But personally, being a systems student, I'm studying system dynamics at the moment. I know Matthew's also studying system change. Speaking to intentionality, there's a saying about systems by Stafford Beer that is, the purpose of a system is what it does. The purpose of a system is what it does. And so, that can help us to be more realistic and to, not consistently say, oh, well, the purpose of this system is this ideology that we would hypothetically hope it would do, and that we imagine people thought it would do when they first created it, but in fact, to, help us see that the purpose of the system is what it is doing. And systems do have a tendency to reproduce themselves and resist change. And so building a system that is based on consent and care is what I heard, rather than punishment and coercion. So thank you again for your answers.
Well, I just want to say that's not what I said. I don't think we should be building systems. I think that systems should only be studied to be dismantled. And I think that we already know what those systems are because we experience them every day. I think that we should build our own type of programming and resources, not another system. Because I think all systems should be dismantled. I'm a full abolitionist. I don't believe in any of these systems. But I do think that we can create programming and resources and whatever our community actually wants, not a system though.
Thank you. And I am very proud to say Bloomington, we do have a lot of grassroots organizations, including many of the sponsors of these events. So I'm very confident in that work to continue and expand. And so next question, the Bloomington Police Department's budget rose by 50% or around $8 million over the 4 years from 2019 to 2023. And in that same time, violent crime rose 24%. And other crimes and calls for service stayed around the same levels. Despite the massive increase in funding of police, our commission's outreach with key stakeholders of all existing city departments related to public safety found that the city is functionally unable to respond in a coordinated and strategic way to address the top 3 most widely acknowledged growing threats to safety in Bloomington, which are the rising or persistent rates of homelessness, drug use, and mental illness. How cost efficient is our city's public safety system, or a traditional policing system, for those of you who aren't that familiar with our city's system? How cost efficient is a traditional policing system at reducing crime, especially violent crime, and other rising threats to safety? And what evidence-based approaches have worked in other communities to reduce crime rates, calls for help, and these other identified threats to community safety?
Notice how impervious, I'll just note for a moment, notice how impervious this bloated punishment bureaucracy that is the police department and is the carceral apparatus that we have to address some of these social problems. Notice how impervious it is to statistical evidence. Here you have, you just said there was a 50% increase in the budget, $8 million over 4 years, yet violent crime went up 24%. Now, if violent crime had gone down 24% after that investment, they'd be saying, see, we've told you the carceral response is the way is the road to more safety. This is what we need to be doing. But it actually goes up, right? And in spite of that investment, and instead of them saying, well, maybe that's an evidence-based reason for us not to continue throwing money at the carceral solution, they're going to double down. They're going to say, well, maybe another $8 million will do something, right? When you put more money into the punishment bureaucracy and crime goes down, they say, see, that's why we need more money. When they put more money in and it goes up, they still say the same thing. We need more money. So there's never anything that happens in which they're not going to say, we need to bloat this bureaucracy even more. And that should be disturbing to any of us who care about evidence-based solutions and interventions in any of these issues. The way that you address houselessness and drug use and mental illness is through people who specialize in those areas, institutions that specialize in those areas, and police are not any of that, any of those institutions or people.
And what about violent crime? Do you want to speak to any evidence-based approaches to reducing violent crime, Dr. Armour?
Oh, yeah, specifically, with respect to violent crime, you know, we all want less violence in our community. But what we have to recognize is one kind of violence. This is what John Rawls recognized in his theory of justice. One kind of violence is structural violence. Houselessness is violence. That's violence against the houseless that we as a society are guilty of. But putting that to one side, to reduce violence overall, we need to make people less desperate in a variety of ways, right? If you think about when we started ratcheting up the carceral system, it's when we started ripping away the social safety net. You know, neoliberal economics with Reagan and then Clinton. Notice, as Clinton was taking away welfare as we know it, took the scissors to that FDR program, welfare, he at the same time was increasing the police budget, saying, I'm going to give billions of dollars more for prisons, et cetera. So there's a direct connection between our refusal to continue to care about one another in a social democratic corporatist kind of way, like Norway and a lot of other European countries, and this kind of neoliberal, rugged individualism approach that we've embraced now. And as long as we keep embracing that, the answer is always going to be a carceral one. So yeah, violence is a serious problem. We need to handle it, but we need to handle it in an evidence-based way.
Yeah.
I think it's the language that we use is also really important. The framing of how we speak about things. I think we throw around the word like violence, violent crime a lot. We don't really have direct open access to seeing like why are people in our jail, right? There's no transparency with that. Like we can't look and see, oh, there's 100 people and this percentage is in there for this or that. But I do know that I had to reach out to the jail maybe a year ago for data for a grant, and I had to ask what's the percentage of people in there for violent crime. I don't remember the direct percentage off my head. Some people in this room might, but I think it was like maybe 18%. So when folks are talking about crime, they're talking about the jail, they're you know, their current sheriff and the jail commander always talk about how, oh, there are murderers in here, they're really dangerous, we can't just let them out.
Like two.
Right. But it's, yeah, right, but like it's so sure, maybe over the past few years, the instances of violent crime, however they determined that, has increased. But I think it's important that we don't play into this stereotype of like everyone that's in jail is like super violent, right? And speaking for just like evidence-based stuff that we've done, when we've been able to secure grant funding and help people pay for housing. So once they're released, we either pay first month's rent, deposit, both, to help them have some time to get on their feet, to get employment. Our recidivism rates for the people who receive those services ranges between like 10 and 12%. With the folks that we just help with like mentoring, help with finding employment, getting personal documentation, those rates range from 20 to 25%. And again, I haven't had access to data from the jail of like what's just general recidivism rates for Monroe County. But I know that there was an article that came out in 2022 that said, I think 50.8% of the folks that were incarcerated in our jail had been incarcerated there. So there are some instances of different recidivism rates based on nothing, no intervention, nothing being offered to help, mentorship, and then also housing, which we found to be most effective.
I think this is why abolition is so important, because when we are always focusing on the what about the rapists and the murderers ideology, we don't actually look at who is in the jail. And when you look at when I think about the film, like Matthew really focused on these abolitionist centered orgs who were doing work in the communities like in Brooklyn, and in LA and other places that were focused on how do we decrease the rate these people are committing crimes, or how do we make sure they don't commit a crime by providing their basic needs. And when we have a system that isn't doing that at all, you're gonna continue to see violent crime go up. Like over the last, since 2020 to now, after the uprising, and all of that, we see a huge amount of increase in police budgets and police resources, police like building these different cop city places, because they see what happens when folks actually do get the resources they need. Like when people are at home in a pandemic, but they're getting their rent paid for. They're able to work from home. They're able to receive mental health resources. 'Cause a lot of folks went to online therapy. They see that the numbers drop and they see the risk in them losing their funding. And so then they say, oh, we gotta do whatever we can to increase that. And that looks like us complaining about violent crime. But I agree, it's a term that you use, like what you consider violent, a lot of folks would not. Like, I don't consider some things as violent as other folks do. And I think especially in Black communities, we don't, like, when I think of like assault or like domestic situations, right? Like if I slap somebody, that's like simple assault, but it was just a slap, right? But that is included in those statistics of like, we have all these violent people out here, but they never break down what are the crimes. Cause it's usually like simple assault or aggravated assault. It's not murder in the first degree or capital murder. It's not those things. When you look at the actual data, like I look at the data for our jail in Memphis all the time. 80% of the people that are there are in there for drug abuse, like having marijuana on them, simple assault, or like having a warrant. So you can get a warrant for anything though. Like you can get a warrant for not going to court for a speeding ticket. So like that happens a lot. But the actual people who are there for a felony or a murder, like 2%. And that's in pretrial. That's not even in the actual prison. So I do think the data matters in that way, but more so in like breaking down what is violence actually.
And a majority of people at that time that I received that data that were in our jail, a significant majority were holds for other jurisdictions. So if we are trying to use our tax dollars, that I assume we all work hard for, right? To invest over $70 million into a new jail complex, because our current jail is falling apart, then why are we holding people from other jurisdictions at our jail? Why are we paying the price for that? And I mean, like our local government needs to.
You're $70 million for that jail.
Million allocated.
It also normalizes police and policing in a very serious way. You know, I mean, it's like she was saying when she was talking earlier about what people consider violent and not violent. Like there are some people that are locked up felonies that are going to be serving like 5 and 10 years for driving while suspended. It's just been gone over and over. They have this thing they do where they put these habitual criminal on you, right? And you can get that for driving while suspended. We knew this poor guy locked up like 4 years of his life. He never committed a crime in his life, but he was dumb about his license. And he just kept driving on a suspended license. And they locked him up once in the jail, and like he thought he had fixed it, but he hadn't. Boom. Now on a habitual, doing 4 years in prison. The dude came out completely changed. Completely, you wouldn't even recognize him. He was like a normal workman guy, and he's like now just this lunatic, you know. But I mean, because he couldn't get to his head, he couldn't figure it out why they locked him up for so long. Even though they told him, you know, what was going on, but to him it was unfathomable in today's society that would happen. And you actually spoke to these people. I mean, like. I remember when I first got to prison, I heard all these people's tales. I thought they were joking with me. I thought they were lying to me. They are the most craziest thing you've ever heard. And they're doing like 20, 15, 10. There's a guy here locally got locked up during the whole big cracks thing for a small 20 piece. It was like his third offense, and he did 20 years on it. Our local guy here, you know, and he's now irreparably, he's not even a piece of the person he was when he left away. He got out recently. And I think that's what the scary part for me is. It's like they're asking for more money for a new jail. I don't care what systems it provides, it's not answering anything, but they know that. You know, they understand that. But to them, bigger the jail, you know, like, they'll keep the light on. More people, it'll increase exponentially no matter what. Especially if they do DOC housing. I don't know if you guys know what this is, but like if you house DOC people waiting to go to DOC, because our prisons are also full, right? they can get money from the state government to hold DOC, to be a DOC holding facility. Which is the scariest thing on earth, if you're ever locked up, to be in a DOC holding jail. It's like, if you thought you'd get to prison, you get to like walk around a bit and have some kind of freedoms or whatever. You don't, you're stuck in a county jail now for like 4 years. And that is the worst time anybody could ever do. You know, like county time versus prison time, once you're down in the system, you want prison. You do not want to be in a county jail. So for these DOC holdings, these people get stuck in like a 2-man cell, 1-man cell, and they get maybe rec once a week, maybe not. In our county jail, it never happens. Rec hardly ever happens. You know, in the 30 years, 20 years I was in and out of that jail, I had rec maybe 10 times. You know what I mean? Like, DOC holdings are horrible, and that's what they're talking about when they get people from other places. It's a DOC holding, and like, it's just it's the most horrifying thing you've ever experienced. And I think that was what I was trying to say, is that the idea that normalizes that for people in our community, that like, well, of course we need a new jail to lock more people up because there's all this crime happening. There's really not all this crime happening. There is crime happening, of course. We're a city, we're growing, but like, not comparative to anybody else, you know.
Just adding to what Jody was saying earlier about budgets and evidence based. In the film, we talk about the Cahoots program and STAR in Denver, Colorado, and you know, community responder models that have where the response teams go out to violent crimes and you know, nobody's been arrested, nobody's been killed. It actually saves those cities money. I was just in Newark, New Jersey last week, and they diverted 5% of the police budget into community response teams, violence prevention, and saw a decrease in crime. So that's happening, and that's only 5% of the budget.
Okay, so thank you for those answers. I heard police should be held accountable, like I'm sure many of us are at our jobs. If we have important key indicators that we're supposed to hit, and if we don't hit those year after year, we're probably not going to keep getting our budgets increased. So why should the police? And you know, speaking to the police not being impervious to the results, as well as keeping in mind the structural violence that Dr. Armour mentioned, so that we're reframing again our ideology to not only seeing personal violence as violence, but also seeing our society's violence against many people in our community. I also really appreciated hearing the need for the more transparency about crime and incarceration data. I wasn't aware that that you know, of those needs in our community. So thanks for sharing those, Jordan. And that there is a very low percentage of people currently incarcerated locally and probably nationally as well for violence. Most are apparently nonviolent offenders. Speaking, you know, Nick, you were mentioning how a lot of people end up becoming felons. And I personally remember, I have some personal family experience with the 3 strikes drug law. Has impacted my family. And so I know a little bit about what that's like to have experienced that system of where you become criminalized, right? Yeah. And now you suddenly have 1 or more felonies, and you know, and so understanding that that is a big business in our society, and that is what our system is doing, is criminalizing people, and the system is reproducing itself and normalizing this. So thank you for that, and to know that, you know, the way out of this is by that you've learned in your work here in this community, Jordan and Nick, which is to provide people with housing, employment, stability, ID, drug treatment, and the things that people are asking for, that they're voluntarily asking for, to provide those things. So thank you all for your expertise on this question. My last question, and then we're going to open it up to public questions. The American Civil Liberties Union has produced several reports detailing how police departments around the U.S. are provided with military grade equipment such as Bloomington's armored Lenco Bearcat vehicle, and detailing how some police departments regularly receive training from members of U.S. allied military forces. Recently, our own Monroe County 911 Review Task Force that included the head of the heads of police and fire, and which was set up by Mayor Hamilton to advise on redesigning our community's 911 emergency response protocols. That task force recommended a pilot program involving the use of overhead flying drones to respond to some calls for help. This has been recommended, not taken action on that I know of. Can you speak to the American tradition of viewing military interference in civilian affairs in relation to both democracy and personal liberty? How might Bloomington residents who are concerned about military developed equipment, technology, and engagement protocols being utilized against our community help protect our civil liberties?
Bradley Balco has a great book out called Rise of the Warrior Cop, in which he chronicles the evolution in policing over the last 40, 50 years, especially in a lot of metropolitan areas, in which they have adopted a kind of paramilitary model. You really see the paramilitary approach to policing out here in LA. This is one of the cities that pioneered that approach, but you see it spreading to a lot of other cities as well. And what that paramilitary warrior cop model suggests, and the way it induces the police officers who are part of it to start to behave, is they start to view members of the community that they're supposed to be serving and protecting as enemy combatants, because that's what you do when you're a warrior cop. When you're taking a paramilitary approach, you know, you're kind of an occupying force now, and you see the citizens you should be serving and protecting as merely enemy combatants, or at least many of them as enemy combatants, especially if they're Black and brown folk. And so you see it in how they start to then, it starts to affect how they even serve warrants and do everyday policing things. You have in LA here, for example, and other places, you have SWAT teams descending on homes and apartments to serve everyday warrants, right? And so it shows you that this approach that, you know, is not anodyne, it's not harmless or innocuous, but rather encouraging this warrior cop mentality through taking on all of these armaments from the Army and the other, you know, military forces is pernicious, and it undermines the relationship between police and the citizens they're supposed to be serving and protecting.
And just adding to that, there's I'm trying to remember the name of the book. There's a former Marine who was a military journalist in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he was talking about how the military actions, the wars that we're engaged in, are the training grounds for how police operate here in the States. And he said in Afghanistan, when he was in combat there were always drones. You know, so you were talking about drones here. You know, the MCATs and the, you know, the armored vehicles, a lot of times they don't even change the camouflage. You know, they just slap, you know, whatever police department sticker is on it, and they put it here. You know, so there's the weapons, there's the training, you know, it also should be acknowledged that a lot of our military are trained by you know, Israeli military, and the Cop City model is built after a lot of the, you know, the ways that they do, you know, do their training and infrastructure in Israel. You know, and I remember, you know, growing up, there's always been a thing about, you know, like US military or the world police, right? There was even a animated comedy movie about that, Team America. Yeah. But it's, you know, it goes hand in hand, the training's hand in hand. The equipment is the same. you know, so just it perpetuates that.
There's also that piece that a while ago, the federales in Mexico needed someone to train them to deal with this problem of cartels, what are they gonna do? What are they gonna do? So at 2019's DPA, 2019's DPA, with the plenary speaker came out and he was a professor from Mexico. He's telling us how, the federales needed help. So they asked American military, come in and train us, we need to know how to deal with this threat here of the cartel. We need to be better than the cartel. So they fly in these like special forces people that are like, proficient in guerrilla warfare and really crazy stuff. And as he's describing to us some of the tactics they taught him on, one of them was, and you might know this from headlines because it then got used elsewhere, but was to take a person's body that's dead, put pieces of it every mile or so marker, so that the people who come upon you know that this is what's going to happen to you. They're going to be pieces of you all over this area. It's like, don't come into my territory type of stuff, right? So these federales, as soon as the training is done, all of a sudden they've dropped out of the federales. They weren't federales. They were people with Mexican cartels. So now the cartels are training US tactics to all of the cartels, these tactics that our government came and gave to them, So the cartels are now operating. I don't know if you saw the last time they tried to capture Chapo's kid. They just shut them down because they have paramilitary training that is so much more than whatever the federales could do, that they can come out and literally send the federales packing and run away because they have all these US weapons and US weapons training to fend them off. Well, of course they do, because they have to protect their interests on the biggest market on the planet. The United States is the largest market they have. It's the only market that they can operate freely in, So I just want to say that like this paramilitarization of our local police stretches out all the way. They play the same card. They play the same game everywhere they go. It's like, they come here and they say, these guys, these gang members, they got Uzis and they got guns. You guys got shotguns and a pistol or two. Now, the response of people in the neighborhoods is, oh shit, the police have AK or AR-47 or AK-47s or AR-15s. What are we gonna do? So it doesn't work the other way around. People aren't just like picking up AR-14s to deal with a cop who's only got a rifle. It doesn't work that way. But the militarization goes all the way through the entire system, from the police all the way down to the cartel. I think it's important to note that that happens on both sides of the coin.
So you're describing like an arms race, basically, that happens.
I just think it happens on both sides. So if you're thinking about here we're militarizing our police, right? At the same token, we've militarized cartels in Mexico. You know what I mean? And those tactics are both being taught to both sides. You know what I'm saying? So at the end of the day, they both know the same tactics. So when they fuel these wars between each other, it's the same thing going on from the same tactics from each person.
I want to directly answer the question that you asked, which is about the drones. I don't think they're a good idea. I think that that's another tactic that we see of people wanting to surveil and control communities. But the militarization of police has been happening for 60, 70 years. It started with the war on drugs. I actually just finished writing. I'm writing in this book about Cop City that's going to come out later this year. And my chapter was about militarization in police and how we see that through these paramilitary groups, but also like how it's prevailed. And it started with the war on drugs, and then also moving into like these different types of paramilitary groups we see within the Atlanta police, within the Memphis police, and how those groups train with the Israeli Defense Forces. And those same people who push for that training through Healy program also push for it in different places. So like thinking of CJ Davis, for example, she started that program in Atlanta, and then she left Atlanta and went to North Carolina in Durham and was a police chief there, and they continued that program. But when she started that program in Atlanta, Memphis started participating immediately. They would send their supervisors with the Gilly program to Israel and have been participating for a long time. So they already are learning those types of tactics. And then they already are using other military style tactics with interacting with people. But now we have this technology like the shot spotters, the drones, they have these huge military tanks that they used on us during protests in like 2020 and 2021 that you've never seen before. But it wasn't until they felt like there's this grave threat of citizens like rising up, pushing back against it, that they all of a sudden are showing up with all these different technologies we've never heard of. We had this one particular protest that I organized downtown, and the sheriff office, the jail, the pretrial detention center is on a main street. And so we were having a protest on that main street. The people in the jail came out with what looked like marble like shields from Captain America, but it was a taser shield. And if they tase somebody, that person would die. It sends out 700 like kilowatts of electricity, and no one has ever seen them before. No one knew where they got them from. And then the sheriff puts out a statement, because I also am an elected official where I live. And so someone told them that I had organized a protest, and they were like, "Oh, I don't want to be on her bad side." So we put out this statement that said they are not supposed to use them on civilians. They're only supposed to use them in the jail, and no one's ever supposed to see them. So really, they were just secretly using this on people. But now that we have it on video and camera that you were using it, now you have to come out and put out a statement to push back against it. But I think my main point is that they have already had these tools for a very long time. The drones thing has been happening in other places, but now it's like, well, we also have all this money, and we already pay our officers, so we don't need to pay them more. But we have all this extra money in our budget because we keep asking for more money. So let's use it on more tools like a drone or another tank and things like that. And I think that the best way to push back against that is also to put in place to like your city council or other governments, that there has to be certain approvals for that type of stuff. So in Shelby County, through our county commission, we put in an approval where the sheriff can't just sign off for military grade equipment. Actually, they can't sign off on any of that. If they want to receive military grade equipment through the 1099 program, they have to get a vote through the county commission. And then the county commission has made it about that they will not be accepting any military grade equipment. So now they don't accept anymore. And now that program is ended, being used in the county, but have to put things in place to make that happen. So by having that in place, we also aren't allowing drones or more taser shields or these other types of weaponry, because you have to go through this long approval process, and they don't want to pay for it. And they're getting it for free through other governments. And so when they have to pay for it, it becomes a bigger thing, because now the community is like, well, why am I paying for drones when we don't have good health care? Or why am I paying for drones when we don't have like libraries that stay open late, or places my kids can go to play? Like, no. And when you create that public like notice, then they aren't able to do things in the dark as much. So I definitely think to advocate and push against that, you need to put things in place that make them put stuff on public notice, versus just make a recommendation and they can just act on it.
I mean, the police militarization goes back a long, long way, as we've kind of learned. I mean, I think, you know, just as a kind of story, right, one that's kind of sort of anecdotal, but also probably a little comical, but like the LAPD in the 1970s, there's these stories of like Chief Ed Davis at the time who was trying to get things like submarines for the LAPD that were then written out of the city council. And so they've long demanded, right, we need these resources and these tools. And often I think it is in response to like urban uprising, right? A lot of this starts after the 1960s, where they're like, we need, you know, if you see the requests from like the Detroit Police Department, the LA Police Department after Watts in 65 or Detroit in 67 or others, is they're asking basically for military arsenals to be able to contain and control uprisings. And so it is this kind of relational piece between struggle and protest, and then the needs of the means to control those moments of protest as well. Right. And so, and by the 80s, we see with the LAPD and elsewhere is they start asking for hollow point bullets, because they're starting to say, oh, these gang members, so-called gang members, they're more militant. They've got these new weapons. And so the police say, well, we need now hollow point bullets, other sorts of things. The LAPD actually has a tank with a 14-foot battering ram on the front of it in the 80s that they used to smash into houses. In so-called crack dens, you know, and they oftentimes used it in kind of the civil liberties question. They end up using it incorrectly, and they smash into people's houses and find like parents eating ice cream with their kids and stuff like that. And so it and that leads to sort of lawsuits and things. But we start to see the way, especially with drones, it reminded me of like when the LAPD and other departments start using helicopters in the 1960s, where they get federal funds to have new programs. One of them, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department starts is called Project Skynight. And they actually talk about in those documents when they put in these helicopter programs, it's about control of space. It's about a way that we can use these sorts of surveillance tools to control space in cities, right? Through these other, and drones are just kind of an updated way of doing that. Let alone, I don't know if the other one that you probably know of, right, is license plate scanners. And so they use all of these ways to try to kind of control and police space in new ways, obviously targeting the most marginalized communities with those. And so it's this long history of the way there's a relation between protests and struggles that demand, that target the police, which then the police use to say, now we need these tools to control those groups as well. So it's kind of,
Instead of just accepting that there is no way to control them, instead of accepting that actually we cannot control people, we're gonna continue to try to put these things in place, even though it's gonna fail every time. I think the correlation between the uprisings that happened in 2020 and 2021 and like the way that these police departments have pushed to find ways to control folks is one that can be the most easily followed, especially with Cop City that we're seeing in Atlanta, but also Cop City in Nashville. That's actually a statewide facility that the governor put in through like an administrative ask, so it wasn't an actual bill that had to be voted on. And it's over 800 acres, so it's way bigger than Cop City. But because it's a statewide facility, it's every single type of police in the state. So our regular police department, but also the state troopers and other paramilitary groups are gonna go here to train. And because he kind of hid it through this administrative ask, people are just now finding out about it. But I think another important thing to bring up is when you were talking about what was happening in LA, I read specifically about like how they would go into people's houses and they would just be sitting there playing checkers or something, and how that was a immediate pushback against them using that because of that. And even the license plate reader thing. So we have license plate readers in Tennessee, but we also have new license plates, and the new license plates are blue. The license plates readers can't scan them. So now they wasted all this money on license plate readers that don't work. And then they got pissed off. And I was like, well, imagine if you weren't putting your money into trying to control and surveil people, actually helping people, and then you wouldn't have wasted millions of dollars that you just spent all throughout the state, that you've installed everywhere. They can't actually scan any. And they can't take the license plates back because they've already produced all of them.
Right.
It will cost them more money to make new license plates. So now they're just screwed and they can't surveil people in that way. So I think it's always interesting to see like the different things they try to put in place that end up not working. The shot spotter things don't work. The cameras, like they have these Blue Crush cameras that are supposed to be recording 24/7. They don't work. The license plate reader doesn't work. And none of that is doing anything to resolve crime or like people's regular livelihood. So it's always interesting to me to see how much money they waste.
well, I think the other thing about that that's key, and I think the 2020 piece we saw, which is what you're talking about, is that the police often frame themselves as victims, right? And so we see that, you know, historically after the 1960s urban uprisings, they're like, and they're talking about like social movements like the Panthers and others in the 60s, and they're like, these claims of police brutality are all false. We're the ones who are under threat, right, as the police. And they use
They're
that,
so afraid.
right, but they use it to spin to get all these things, right? So why do we think we saw those police union chiefs like in New York and elsewhere post 2020 coming out and saying, we're the ones that are victims here, not people that we're shooting on the street, right? Because they use it to position themselves in that way, I think is really what we start to see, how they're trying to shape that narrative to gain all these tools, right, that they say they then need.
And that narrative really bounced back on them because this whole "we're so afraid" thing, then quit your job. Why are you doing it? And that's the pushback they got. So now I don't hear that anymore because all we hear is we're just so afraid, you know, the citizen could have this on them or that, then quit. Don't be a police officer. If you're afraid to do it, then why are you doing it? And now they don't say that anymore because it's right. If you're so afraid to do the job, go get another one. But saying you're fearful for your life when you knew that you were risking whatever when you signed up for it, we don't want to hear that.
Yeah, and that is what I've heard our local police chief say in response to questions about the Bearcat, for instance. He said publicly, you know, that there are people out there with all these dangerous weapons and, you know, police are vulnerable. And, you know, really stressing the fact that that the armor is for defense, right? Not as a assault, you know, not for offense, but it sounds like, you know, overall, you know, we're hearing that, you know, a lot of the militarization of police has come as a response to public struggle, protests, from the sixties, which I assume were anti-war and civil rights based struggles we're talking about in protests?
Well, yeah, I mean, both, but a lot of the like urban uprisings in response to police killing and other broader inequality, otherwise known as what at the time were termed riots.
LA riot,
But we
yeah.
use uprising,
Mhm.
yeah.
And so we're looking at these protests, uprisings through the lens of the ideology of control. So instead of seeing those and going, oh, maybe we should listen to what they're saying, change things, we're going, oh no, we're gonna surveil, we're gonna control. Thank you for the book recommendation, Radley Balco, Rise of the Warrior Cop. We're seeing cops as warriors, yet they have a victim mentality. This kind of adds to the hero panache, right? They're like, and then we've, view, and this ideology then, even if what I'm hearing is, that even if they're not having military weapons and it's only defensive things and surveillance technology, even with that, it's harming the relationship between the police and the community, because it is causing the police to see their fellow citizens more as enemy combatants, and possibly vice versa, right? And for people to see police more as an occupying force rather than people that we're paying to protect us. And so that's undermining that relationship. And I also really appreciated Amber's comment that the drones and the technology and the surveillance technology to control the public space is extremely capital intensive. And coming from a business economics background, one thing I've noticed in this whole conversation is that a lot of the solutions that have been put forward to be provided are not capital intensive. They're in fact labor intensive solutions that create jobs and don't require a lot of money to pay people to provide those care services, the care economy. So, and I also really appreciated the suggestion to put in approvals in place to help protect. So that is a very actionable advice for our local community. So thank you for that. At this time, I would like to let everyone know, especially here, this event is going to go on a couple more hours, and feel free to visit the restroom. It's out in the hallway. The men's is right here. The women's is at the end of the hall on your own, whatever you need to. We're not going to take a break just for that, so we can keep the momentum going. And so at this time, we would like to encourage everyone who's online to put their questions in the chat. My fellow CAPS community member who's off screen, Jason, is oh, perfect. Jason will be moderating the online questions, and he will be reading those. And then we will we'll take turns. So we'll do one online question, and then we'll do one from our in-person audience. So if you can be thinking of those and simply put your hand up at the right time. So should we start with an online question?
Sure. So we do have an online question, and this kind of touches on, or it comes back to something that Matthew touched on, mentioning the CAHOOTS program, which our city council has looked into, and the Denver Star program, which I personally looked into for our report. And it kind of touches on one of the recommendations that we have in the report to conduct a feasibility study. But rather than conducting the study, this asks about your perspectives on the feasibility. So I'll read the whole context of the question. So Hunter Cullen asks, or says, the Bloomington Police Department and the Indiana University Police Department have their own team of mental health social workers, and I already have one assigned to me from the regular department due to my mental health issues. Unfortunately, if someone calls 911 or 988, they would send regular law enforcement after the individual in a crisis, and it only increases the chances of escalation, incarceration, and other legal problems. The city of Bloomington is about to build a bigger jail and includes unneeded incarceration units for the mental health inmates. So Hunter asks, and I'll shift it so it's an open question versus a yes/no question. How might it be possible for Mayor Thompson and the CAPS Commission to expand the department to include a mental health crisis intervention team instead of dispatching regular law enforcement as a de-escalation technique in case an individual has a mental health crisis?
And before you answer, I want to correct myself because I just said a second ago that we're going to go on 2 more hours, but we're going on 1 more hour. I don't want to scare anyone.
I got a little scared.
So yeah, thank you for that wonderful question, Hunter. And Hunter's a good friend of mine, so I'm so happy he could attend this today.
I mean, I think we've tried some of this. I think an idea is to invest robustly in peer services, and I don't just mean peer recovery coaching, I just mean peer services, investing in some sort of response that isn't a police response, but that's also really hard because every time you try to do that or set up like that 988 line or whatever it is, it never ends up the way you expect it to end up, It always ends up with some cop showing up. Or like an officer that says they're not an actual officer, they're an officer who's a social worker. But to our people, as you, Jordan, they're not hearing that, they don't, that's horrible, So if it was something that was, you'd have to set up the whole infrastructure that someone would have to be able to bleed off calls from 911. I mean, it's just, I think abolition comes really strongly into terms when I think about this because it's like every time I go through this in my process, it's always where I come on to. You just have to rip it down. The stuff we have is not set up for humans. It's set up for them. What works best for them, what works best for police, because they've never cared what works best for us. Why should they? They don't care. It's no skin off their backs if we all suffer. We're a small part of the community. So I think we would have to really look into like robustly funding a peer network to deal with these type of problems that also had like LCSWs and other people on hand to make sure that if a serious thing was going on, it was addressed in real time. Not waking up to a cop showing up who doesn't give a shit what you're going through, or even an officer from the police who's like a social worker. It doesn't matter. You wear the moniker of law enforcement. You have power we can't contend with. It's like I heard the other day of someone, like an officer giving a de-escalation training, and I thought, how does someone with all the power give a de-escalation training? That's madness. You know what I mean? It's like, you have all the power. We're never gonna feel like you can tell us about de-escalation. It's good. I'm glad it's being done. You know what I mean? In certain places, I'm sure it works very effectively. But just for me, I was like, my gut reaction was, how is that possible? So I think we need to think about like what we invest in. We have people to deal with certain things that they could be robustly dealing with inside our jail. There's people who do mental health, they can deal with that. We just think we need to tear it down and form a system that works better is the only thing I can think of.
I definitely think there needs to be moves towards not trying to build within policing systems.
Right.
And I think that one that starts with defeating the cop in your head. I think that people automatically go to ways to, remove the way that people are policing them. And it's always through a lens of punishment. Instead of trying to build something within the police department, build it within your community. Like there's a really cool system in Louisville, Kentucky called Care Bears, where like when there's a protest or when people, when it snows there a lot, they have care teams that go out and offer like care packages to folks, but also ask them what they need. If they need a certain resource, they can guide them to that, but you don't need police to do that. And the police in Memphis, I'll never forget this, when we were on Clubhouse really heavy during the pandemic, there was a police officer in the Clubhouse room talking about how he doesn't understand why they even have them doing mental health calls, so they don't even feel equipped to do it. And they've told their superiors all the time, like, we don't feel equipped to do this. We're not built to handle this. This is not something we should be handling, but they still have them handling mental health calls. So that to me, that shows that one, we're so invested deeply in the policing system that we don't care about the outcome of what actually happens to people. And even when the police officers are saying that they can't do it, they're still gonna force them to do it because they have to be able to justify the amount of money they're getting or be able to justify wanting more money. And that means we have to say, well, police are answering so many of these mental health calls. There's, we need more money for that. Like just ways to continue justifying that. But I think there's really good examples of different systems for orgs like Cat 911 in California or the Anti-Police Terror Project. They do a really good like healing justice center work around how to de-escalate situations during protests, but also how to de-escalate situations during mental health crisis. And they offer abolitionist and trauma-informed center trainings that people can ask for their different groups. So I think those systems are actually out there. It's more so like, are you willing to put in the time and the labor? Like, what value do you put on saving a Black life? Like, what value do you put on that? And are you willing to sacrifice some time to make that happen? Because in this capitalist society, all folks want to do is make money. And because you can't make money from this, other than like the value you put on a life, I can't make an income from this, right? So do I really want to do that? So I think it's really involves you reevaluating like how much you value Black and brown lives and how much you're willing to put on the line and sacrifice for that, including 2 hours of time, you know, a day or a few hours a week. Anti-Police Care Project, they're doing it on like a cycle. They have a few people who do it a few hours throughout the week and then they transfer to another person. And you can sacrifice. I feel like my life is worth you sacrificing those few hours. So it really depends on asking yourself that.
Yeah, I would add that, and the question for Dr. Armour, I know you, just came back, it's about mental health response in particular, and how might our community respond better to mental health crises. I would point out our report, has statements in there in the testimony from police in our community. And the police say that they are not equipped, trained, or qualified to respond to mental health crises. They don't want to be responding to these crises. Yet a part of the problem in our community that everyone recognizes is that we do not have the mental health resources. So even if we wanted to overnight, say, change the protocols and send mental health experts, we don't have them in our community. So I know a couple of the possible solutions that are also in our report that we recommend is for creating the capacity. So for our city to become a funding vehicle to get state and federal funds that exist for these services, to bring those funds to our community, to then channel them to the appropriate local, grassroots, private, non-government organizations who are doing that good work, and to expand their capacity, right? That's capacity building, and that's something our city can do to help our community respond to these needs that we have. And I also would mention that in our city, which I think is very common, the police control the 911 protocols, and they decide who goes to what calls. And so another important recommendation in our report is that we are hoping this new Department of Community Safety and Resilience, whose only priority is human safety, whose main priority is human safety, should be the important decision maker in deciding those protocols, along with police, fire, and other emergency response departments. So I would put those two solutions forward that our commission has recommended, and put it back to the panel, continue answering Hunter's question.
Well, you know, when we have police officers saying things in chat rooms, et cetera, about how they don't feel equipped to handle mental health calls, that's fine. But what we need is more than a few voices out there, you know, saying that, but commitment by either the rank and file or the leadership in police department to cede some of their power, to cede some of their resources to these alternatives, rather than to just give lip service to that, and to actually pay the price of their insights and their convictions about these sorts of alternatives. And, you know, that's part of the political process and struggle that we're in, right? We're trying to have folks rethink safety. That's what Matthew's film was all about. But, you know, we may not only have to draw on grassroots organizations, they're the most vital. You know, we're the ones actually at the grassroots level being affected by these policies, but also draw on police themselves. Like I said, I belong to this organization, LEAP, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and they send police spokespeople out all over the country to speak to other police officers in their own headquarters about how they need to start rethinking safety. They need to get out of mental health. They need to bring in cahoots kinds of programs. They need to get out of the prohibition mentality. You know, a lot of times, just from a rhetorical standpoint, it's very helpful to get police saying some of the same things that some of our more progressive members are saying in our communities. People, for whatever reason, they'll give that, some people, some constituencies will give that additional weight. It's the same kind of thing I see with progressive prosecutors, that we have here in LA, George Gascon, and Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, a number of progressive prosecutors around the nation who are saying, let's take these are what used to be top cops, right? Who were in real tight with their, with police and with, not prosecuting them, who are saying, no, we're going to prosecute police. We're going to rethink how we're going to approach these issues. And to have that coming from prosecutors' offices, as well as law enforcement organizations, can really make a rhetorical impact in a lot of these debates.
Thank you. David?
Yes, hi, I'm David
Yeah,
Keppel.
please introduce yourself and ask your question.
David Keppel, Bloomington Peace Action Coalition. I was listening to some of your discussion of the militarization of treating things as riots, which are protests. Wouldn't it be a good idea for leaders of social justice causes to partner with your commission, Nejla, and with the Bloomington City Council and sit down with members of the Bloomington Police Department and create a compact for nonviolent protest? I would like some of our organizations to bring Erica Chenoweth, whom some of you may know about, who's written a book on nonviolent protest. She really should be a major lecturer here in Bloomington on how we can have non-confrontational protest that is impactful. I mean, here, this university has used the excuse of security to cancel a major exhibition by a Palestinian artist that was ridiculous. But I think we could make it harder for authorities to make those excuses if we took the initiative to form, if you will, a compact that had
David?
approval.
Yeah, what do our panelists think of this idea of a compact for nonviolent protest in our community?
Yeah, it's gonna be a no for me. First of all, I don't organize with the police. Secondly, there's no such thing as a nonviolent protest. Those two words don't even go together. Protest can be whatever it wants to be. It can be violent, it can be nonviolent, whatever. But the whole source of it is for folks to express themselves however they see fit. And I think that white people especially, the urgency and the will to want to make things seem nonviolent as a way to say that, see, we're safe, we're just speaking out a little bit, is directly pushing back against what folks want in a protest. The whole reason why people are protesting is because something has been done wrong to them, or because people aren't listening when they aren't being heard. And when you try to put rules around that, that makes people not want to participate. Especially if you're gonna say we're gonna organize with the police and the way they respond to it. Because I don't organize with the police. The police don't have my safety or concern in mind. And when you do that, that also pushes back on some people who have a different distaste for the police. Like, people don't trust the police. And so if you say, oh, you can come to this protest, it's nonviolent, it's safe, we talk to the cops, they're not gonna arrest us, I'm never gonna trust you again. Because why are you talking to the police in the first place? But I also think you should do the work, the inner work in yourself to ask why your thought is to push back and make something nonviolent, or say that using this language of nonviolence with protests, because that's a white supremacist term. The idea that I have to add this moniker to something to make where people would think that I'm less likely to be a criminal or doing something wrong, is built on white supremacy. Because civil disobedience, which happened in the civil rights movement, was just that, it was civil disobedience, not protest. Protesting does not have any rules. And it depends on the people who are fighting back and against the issue of how they want that to happen. So if I want to go shut down a bridge, which I just did 2 weeks ago, right? That was a protest in support of Palestinians. I didn't tell people on the bridge, if you get up here, you want to do something, don't do it. I didn't say that, because it's not my place to say how you want to react to Palestinians being murdered, to your cousin being killed, and the government ignoring you. And a lot of folks would say, well, that was violent for you to take over a bridge. but I think that stems off of what the people want to do. I have to find a way to disrupt the commerce and economy somehow. And me stopping the bridge for 2 hours, they lost $3 million. So I think that when you add those monikers, it makes people less likely to want to organize with you, and you should think further around that, because a lot of that is built off of white supremacy.
Sam, do you have a comment to this question?
I guess it's a comment tied to a question, but I know we want to go online, so I can hold it. I just,
I have one comment also, and with the question and the suggestion also operates under the premise that cops are acting in good faith. Police lie, police will change the rules to, fit their narrative. If we agree on certain protocols for, a peaceful protest or whatever it is, it's at their discretion, or like we saw in LA specifically. I know it happened all over, outside agitators came in and threw bricks, or police who were in plain clothes, came in and started stuff. And mostly it was just people, yelling and marching and all of that. So I just wanted to add that part in, and I agree totally.
And one other piece, right, I think that we have to consider is the way that a lot of state legislatures have also passed a lot of laws, right, that are criminalizing protests, right, by saying like, you have to be, I forget what these specifics are, but it's like, it provides the police with a lot more authority to arrest people in those moments, right? So we see this kind of broader, I think, kind of coming to the police narratives, right, where they're also empowered by these new laws. I think we saw some in Florida. I think there was one in Indiana. I forget if it was passed a year or two ago that would, that makes it so that trying to tamp down on protesting using kind of legal mechanisms as well, which gives the kind of police more authority over this as well. Something to consider.
And governments will try to utilize even the most, basic type of protest. We had a occupation of like the park across from the Capitol building for over 60 days in Nashville. And because of that, even though it was just people sitting in a park, they weren't even like having rallies or protests, but they were just sitting in the park, drinking, having snacks, talking with each other. There was never any like marches or anything. They were just literally occupying that space. The legislature across the street passed a bill saying that if more than 2 people are in an area, then they can classify that as a riot. And it's up to the police or the state troopers to decide whether or not that's a riot. So when you add these monikers of like, this is a peaceful, nonviolent protest, you have to remember that there are people just sitting in a park somewhere who are now told that this is federal land. And if you are over here and it's more than 3 of you, we can say that this is a riot and you're gonna get a felony charge.
Yeah, thank you. And I really liked how you framed it as well in the beginning, that to remember that the reason we are having protests or uprisings or whatever they're called is as a response to the structural violence that people are experiencing. And so keeping that in mind. And I know on time, we've got about 10 minutes left. So I do want to, okay, yeah, let's go to Tonda.
okay, 40 minutes, don't we?
Oh, sorry, it's because that's like in military time, that clock. What time it is? It's not 10 to 4?
It's 10.
Oh,
4:30.
oh, yeah, we're going to 4:30. Okay. Sorry, yeah, so we've got.
It's a construct.
Okay. Okay,
I guess, so I was gonna I had a question. I think it does tie in with what you said about, a lack of trust that, for the lack of trust that's there of policing, also of, most government structures, and, some suggestions, especially from maybe a conflict resolution standpoint for, reporting. Meaning that we talked a little bit about statistics and how oftentimes just my own personal experience, or if I'm amplifying and supporting somebody else's experience, where if it's not what somebody wants to hear, they might go, well, I would like to see the data. Yes, you've described 3 examples of how this injustice happened, but those might just be some, there might be reasons. It might have really been their fault. Give me some data to show that it's happening. What I've noticed in my experience is it is very difficult to encourage somebody to report a hate crime, to report discrimination, to actually take the time and belief and trust that if they were to fill out an online form to report a hate incident or a discrimination in fair housing or anything, that, that there's not gonna be retaliation, first of all, and I think that's what keeps, when the US DOJ was here, earlier, talking about reporting on hate crimes, talking about retaliation, also that trust that something will even come out of it. What would you recommend to start building that trust back into those systems, so we at least have data that's representative or that's accurate? It's not representative. How do we put some systems? How do we do some coalition building? How do we start with conflict resolution and community building? So at least we're getting accurate data on these events that are happening in our community.
I mean, for me, it's about community. You mentioned coalitions. It's about, you know, being part of communities that are supportive, that are doing the work, that are like Amber mentioned, Anti-Police Terror Project, like they do online trainings for de-escalation and like all kinds of things, you know, and then you have your, you know, organizers here in your community that are doing excellent work. And so, you know, it's, you know, we're fighting against systems that are invested in maintaining their power, right? So the only way to really combat that is to have more power, you know, on the other side through organizations and the coalitions with organizations. That if one of the things I'm doing as a result of traveling around the United States is I'm working with some other organizations to bring all the different groups that I've met, the different people that I've met together. So that, because, you know, what I was finding was, you know, people are kind of isolated in their own cities, right? But if, you know, folks in Memphis know what folks in Sacramento are doing, or folks in Newark, or, you know, here, even just knowing who's doing what makes a difference, but then finding ways to work together and expand and leverage that power. So yeah, I mean, there's not, unfortunately, there's not like a one size fits all thing, because it really, you know, it's about dismantling systems. It's about doing our own internal work also. You know, Amber mentioned the, you know, the cop inside our head, soft cops, you know, which Miriam Cobbett talks about, you know, what the part of us that's invested in revenge, you know, and punishment, but rewiring ourselves. And we do that through community with others, because that's how we, you know, develop those relationships and the connections where it's not like you and me and we're separate, but it's like, no, we're working together because we care. You know, so it's all of that. And unfortunately, we're fighting against the many years of programming. That's, you know, not just, you know, with the systems, but like our TV and movies and things like that all feed into, you know, as Max was talking about the chronology of militarization of LAPD, I'm thinking, oh, Lethal Weapon 3 was like the top killer bullets, and, you know, Cobra was this thing. And so it's all of that, but it all goes back to being in community.
Yeah, I think, as one quickly thing, I think that, part of what he was mentioning about community also means that you can't look for solutions through actual systems you want to dismantle. Like as an abolitionist, I'm not going to the police because something happens to me. I'm going to my community and using transformative justice to look at what, like, how can we resolve this conflict or this issue? And so when you're asking about reporting and things like that, I wouldn't encourage that. What I would encourage is for people who are harmed to have a way to resolve their harm that's based off what they feel is necessary. And I wouldn't go to the police for that.
Oh, absolutely.
And I also think that you can get the data, things like that, through other like means. We have a data transparency ordinance that we passed in Memphis that the city council passed. So I didn't have to go to the police and ask for data. I went to the city council and said, hey, the best way for us to track this data is for you to pass a transparency ordinance that requires that they keep a live month-to-month database that shows how they're stopping people for traffic stops and what the stops are and what the demographics are. They passed it. So I think not looking to create things within systems you want to dismantle, because we don't want to keep the police, right? We want to abolish the police. And also creating systems or like different types of tactics within organizing, within your community of, hey, if this happens, you know, how do you want to resolve that? Because in the 60s and 70s in Black communities, when a man went out and raped a child, they put tires around his body and set him on fire. People start raping kids. So when you allow communities to resolve their issues, which I believe in, and whether that's violent or not, I think the community should be allowed to have the discernment and decisions around what they want to happen between their communities. And if that looks like violence within their community, then that's their decision to make. But deterrence looks like different things, and I don't think the police should be allowed to be involved in that process.
Follow-up then is part of what the, kind of the next step after this panel and what you're asking people to sign up for is if they want to continue to be part of these community conversations. Is that what the, kind of the next step is going forward for those of us in this locality?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, we are asking everyone in our community to join the Bloomington Community Safety Roundtable. It's currently just an email list. We hope to get going with it very soon. Yeah, we definitely would like to act on a lot of the ideas that have been shared by our panelists today. I really appreciated the idea, Amber, also of the ordinance of the data transparency. Our report did have some suggestions for key indicators, the whole that the city could start using, and also for more for live databases for the public. But yeah, that is right now what the CAPS Commission is asking, is for the community to be involved in this roundtable, and it's just meant to be an organization of communities. Individuals and organizations in our community who can help develop these ideas together with the commission, right? Because we're just a few volunteers. And we see our role as facilitators, right? We know we're not the experts. That's why they're all here. And so, yeah, we're really asking the community to help us and the experts like yourself and other people here who work in these organizations to help us develop these ideas going forward. So we hope the roundtable will meet every 2 to 3 months. We're actually currently in talks with CJAM, Community Justice and Mediation, to help us structure the roundtable. There are local community resolution experts. A lot of them are trained, and they've worked with our commission in the past as well to put on public events. So we're really looking forward to the safety roundtable. If you want to add anything to that, Jason?
I was just gonna clarify that that is a community roundtable. So like we are a city appointed entity. So we can make suggestions to the city government, but we can also coordinate people who actually can make change here and now in the community. So that's what we're hoping for. We're doing both, right? So we're making suggestions to the governance, but then also coordinating people who do the work on the ground and engage mutually.
Thank you for that. You want to add it? All right. So next question, do we have an online question to go to at this time? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, I am on the city council. My colleague Hopi Stossberg is also here. So we are concerned and we are listening, and I would like to know if anybody has suggestions for how to open more minds in the community to abolition. Like, people who came here are largely self-selected people who are already leaning that direction. But when I talk to, of course, colleagues in the city government, a lot of constituents, you know, homeowners, upper middle class, white people, they just think it's crazy.
Us too.
So what is a good way to reach out to people? I mean, I would love to just say, okay, everybody has to watch this film and have a talk about it, but do you all have any suggestions for kind of opening people's eyes to the systemic injustice that really just needs to be overthrown?
One, I would say upper middle class white people think that they're the police too. They think that because they have money that they are able to question and surveil other people. It's like an automatic thing, and my mama does it, she black. So it's not just a white thing, but also like the more access people have to wealth, the more they act like the police. So I think that it's kind of hard to push the abolition thing with those people. So I talk in a way of thinking of like different types of resources and programming that technically is abolition, but they don't think of it in that way. So the way that we've pushed different ordinances in Memphis, like around pretextual traffic stops, like not using the police to do pretextual traffic stops because they're just pretextual traffic stops.
Could you explain?
So
what that
pretextual traffic stop is stopping someone for a financial requirement, like their brake light being out or their registration being late. Things that are not actual safety hazards, right? I'm not speeding, I'm not wearing my seatbelt. I just don't have my registration paid for, or my brake light is out because I can't afford to fix it, or my bumper might be hanging loose, or might be missing a bumper completely. But that doesn't mean I'm an unsafe driver. I could still be driving the speed limit and going back from home to work just fine. But police use that as a first violation to stop someone to then check for other things. And most Black people are killed during pretextual traffic stops. If you like listen to different reports talk about it, like, oh, they stopped them for something hanging in their mirror. It was a cafeteria worker, the guy who worked at the school. He has him hanging in his mirror, and that's why they stopped him, shot him. So we remove pretextual traffic stops, and by removing that, people have 43% less interactions with police.
Removing it from the police so that it's being responded to by a civilian.
It's not being responded to at all. It's a financial requirement. It's not a safety issue. It's not a safety concern. Something hanging in my mirror, I'm still a good driver. Like a crack in my windshield doesn't make me unsafe. My bumper missing or hanging off or my brake light being out, that does not make me unsafe. I'm not speeding or doing any other thing that is technically an actual real crime. And so pushing towards that means that police interact with those people less. So we have 43% less interaction with police for pretextual traffic stops. So you can start with simple things like that, even though it's being attacked right now in the State House, but it's totally different. But locally, there are lots of, we were the 6th city to do it, and the most popular city was Philadelphia. And so it's called the Driving Equality Act, and that's a simple way to begin abolition. And once they see that by not doing pretextual traffic stops, you're actually not creating any harm, but you're also putting Black folks in a safer position, then they're more open to other ideas like harm reduction centers and things like that. And I also think talking to wealthy white folks in a language they understand, they send their little white kids to rehab all the time. Black folks don't get that same like luxury, right? I've seen plenty of cases where someone has committed an actual crime, like a child has committed a crime, raped someone, molested someone. They sent their child to a therapy center, rehab center in California, and the case gets dismissed. Why wouldn't we offer that same grace to Black people? So like pushing for those kind of programs within the city of like harm reduction programs, therapy programs that people with access and money go to all the time. They use it all the time, and it's a deterrence. The kid doesn't reoffend or the kid doesn't get any more trouble, but because I have the money to do that, I can send my child to these centers that are most likely not where I live and actually have them receive help and services they need. So I start there, like just thinking of ideas that don't mention abolition. I don't say abolition at all. I talk about harm reduction. I talk about care, talk about ways to offer people care and therapy and mental health resources that are in turn steps towards abolition, because the more money and services are removed from the police, the more likely I am to abolish them. But you can't abolish them without having those things set up in place. So if you go ahead and set them up in place, then it's easier to say, hey, we don't really need them, actually, because you see they're not even responding to a lot of calls. And most of the people who are getting services and using these programs are folks going to this harm reduction center or these mental health services. And then it's easy to remove money from their budget.
I will say also, I've had some really positive response from middle and upper class white folks who've seen the film, who are like, we knew it wasn't working, or it's working how it was designed, but it's not working in terms of keeping everybody safe. We're terrified of defund the police, but I get it now. And so then they're going out and having conversations, and it's causing shifts for them, in how they see things and do things, and whether or not they call the police. There's another thing which maybe Jody can speak to, is like the intersection of music and art and abolition. Because I know like Jody does work around that at his place, where that's another way to build community and raise awareness, and not calling it abolition, but it's all tied in as well. So
Yeah, well, abolition, along with defund the police, are two words that or defund the police, well, the 3 words, and then abolition, both those notions, take abolition, sound to many people when they first hear it, it sounds absurd, counterintuitive, and radical, right? Whether you're talking police abolition or prison abolition. And if you hear the words defund the police, it sounds again, I even hear progressive police officers viscerally react against that. They can't think straight when they hear those words. So for one thing, from a messaging standpoint, when I talk to a lot of folks who are not already the choir, when I'm not preaching to the choir, I won't use the words defund the police. Instead, I'll use the words like unbundle the police, right? And when I use just that little change, unbundle the police rather than defund the police, unbundle them so that they're not doing mental health interventions, unbundle them so they're not doing drug addiction interventions, unbundle them so they're not doing housing, houselessness interventions. They say they don't want to be saddled with that themselves, right? So just coming up with some language that isn't triggering for some of these people. Now, I still use it. Defund the police has been an enormously valuable and powerful slogan, right? The reason it's still around 4 or 5 years later is because it has teeth to it. It moves people. It shakes them up a little bit. And we can say, well, you weren't complaining about defunding education, and you weren't complaining about defunding our mental health, and defunding defunding all of these other kinds of social welfare programs. You didn't have any problem with defunding as language back then. So it can be very helpful, but it can also be unnecessarily polarizing. And you can still get at the same points without necessarily using that language. And then, like Matthew was saying, we enlist a lot of artists. From John Legend, I'm out here in LA. We are constantly enlisting artists to come in and make these same arguments and drive home these same points. And for whatever reason, people will often listen to the artist, initially at least, it breaks the ice, and then we can come in behind them. Now, it's a double-edged sword because some of these artists don't know, I don't know what they're saying sometimes. They'll say something pretty ridiculous, so it depends on the artist. But if you find the right artist at the right time, I found that can be extremely powerful, just like filmmaking is an art form. Matthew's film, Reimagining Safety, is a powerful art form that is changing the conversation around the country. Books can do that. John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, all the way up to bestsellers now, can do that. Songs and, I've even seen dance and other kinds of art forms that can have a rhetorical impact on audiences that you're trying to move. So I would just think about the messaging. You don't have to say defund, or you don't have to say abolition all the time to all audiences. You can make the same, and I think this is what Amber was saying. You can make the same substantive points without using that particular labeling.
In Newark, actually, there's a couple of organizers who are putting together a Reimagining Safety event that's going to include the film, but we'll also have local musicians and artists and displays and things like that. So just ways to get the message in without even mentioning, like Jody was saying, mentioning defund or abolition or things like that.
I know from the commission's perspective, this was something we talked about when we first got started 3 years ago. And Jason, being a student of rhetoric himself, we sort of all agreed that, we wanted to do this work in a way that brings people together, that is, inclusive and not alienating people. And so we on the commission have really tried to focus on using terms like community safety, and not abolition or defunding the police, even though there's probably some shared goals, those different contexts. And And I also think that, you know, our focus on care and dignity, you know, again, just framing things in a positive rather than negative way, right? Abolition is just negative, you're destroying or something, right? Deconstructing something. Whereas we care, you know, and dignity, we're providing care, we're upholding human dignity. And so from the commission's perspective, we fully echo the points that we've heard here today. We're trying to help our community have that discussion in a positive way that can be welcomed by many different people.
Right, well, another way to do it, and the kind of the abolitionist tenet is sort of like, what do we want to invest in as well, right? And I know the programs that we have two people here, right? It's like, what, if you can talk to people, like, wouldn't you like to see investment in what would you like to see invested in, right? What would we want the world to look like, right? If we had these other things, is it, you know, all the programs that we have in terms of the folks here, right? And so it gets people thinking about not necessarily that question of defunding, which scares all these people, right? But that, what do we build? Start there. What do we want to make? What do we want to see if we were to invest in those, in other things? Whether that's healthcare, whether that's mental health, whether that's rehabilitation, right? All of the, or, you know, and harm reduction, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, I like that. And that's the opposite of defunding, right? It's investing. So what are we going to be investing?
I think
Let me
also-
hasten to add one thing real quickly, and that is, you know, I'm a big messaging person. I tell I teach law students, and I tell them all we're learning in law school is rhetoric, right? You're learning to persuade people. You never open your mouth or write anything with your pen unless you're trying to persuade somebody of something. That's what a lawyer does. So I'm very, you know, appreciative of the importance and value of rhetoric and framing and all that. On the one hand, that's why I led with saying, you know, maybe we can find different messaging strategies. But at the same time, please don't, as activists, try to tone police other activists who do want to use language like abolition, who do want to use language like defund the police, because they have been very effective over the years in using that and sometimes raising issues that way, right? So I hate to see us punching left. I too often see people on the left punching other people on the left, you know, punching further on the left. So, you know, recognize that we can be very pragmatic and we're going to do our thing and be as efficacious as we can, following the rhetorical strategies that we are, but recognize that those alternative rhetorical strategies that use language like abolition and defund the police also have their place and have been very effective in their own way.
Yeah. Jordan, you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just gonna add, like, not necessarily on a larger level, like, you know, the work with like city council and these big policies and stuff, but on just like a smaller, like more personal level, I think a lot of people, they like, you don't know what you don't know, right? And I can remember like a few instances that have happened to me that like will always stick with me. I remember being in undergrad, and I had a Black friend in class, and we were talking about staying at Airbnbs or something like that. And he said he would never go to an Airbnb at night because as a Black man, if you were entering a house at night that, you know, he didn't live in, that he was worried that the cops would get called and something, you know, terrible would happen. And I remember thinking like, holy shit, that's something I've never had to think about. Never in my life have I ever had to think about something like that. I remember receiving letters from folks incarcerated here in our jail that told us they needed help signing up for insurance and their parents couldn't help them because their parents couldn't read. Never had to worry about that. I've never had to think about my parents not being able to read, right? So I think like people don't understand the impact of something like drones or police militarization if those consequences of those things may not directly affect them. So I think being able to try and humanize people and their real lived experience to others, right? Like, we can't expect that emotional labor to all fall on to like Black and brown people or these oppressed, marginalized people. Part of that is on us to help more people understand what that is like.
Yeah, and I have a question, for the panel, actually based on the film. And in the film, Alex Vitale mentions how police, regardless of their individual orientation, towards policing, at the end of the day, are violence workers. They're employed to employ violence. And my question is, in what ways might, debundling the police and creating more of a consent-based approach to safety, in what ways might that benefit people who currently work as police and their families? And I guess the other way to ask this question is, in what ways does our current traditional system harm the police, the workers who are working as police and their families or people in the community?
I think the idea is that you allow them to be in this place where they're other than, like, I think that's talked about a bunch here, then, like, you put them into a place of superiority or a place of like moral rightness or for whatever thing. And anytime you do that with anybody, that becomes part of their culture and they internalize that, right? And the problem is that they aren't anything special. In fact, to get into being a cop is very minimal education, very minimal education, And I think the idea is, like, I always wondered, when I was a child, don't they have to like go to a 4-year university to become a cop? They have like the most power. Shouldn't they have the most amount of teaching? And it's nothing. In fact, some people can go from being working in the jail to being a deputy with a couple tests, And I think it's a disservice to them, and I think it's a disservice to all of us that we choose to have a structure built like that. We take people with mental health problems, undiagnosed mental health problems, and delusions of grandeur, and maybe they were bullied when they were younger. I mean, there's this whole shift that happens to people that become police officers. There's like this type person that comes in there, and then they become righteous. Now they have the arm of God in their hand and the arm of the law, and they roll out like that. And I think for the individual who rolls out like that, they're living in an entire false narrative, like a video game in their head. It's like these people don't deal with reality. No one's above them. Who's telling them no? General Order of Police is the largest gang in the world. I mean, they're literally the most, especially in Indiana, they're like the power, I think it creates a horrible system that now the rest of society hates them. Like you place these same cops inside a prison, they're done. They're done. They can't live a life inside prison. Done. You put them, once you see them break down, like some of these cops that like have a crime and then they stop being a cop, right? They're broken animals, because they had all this power and then it's gone. I think that until we community police, we're even giving how we choose to police people that power in this very nature hurting the people that become police, by giving them a false sense of righteousness and a false sense of power that really is just what we give them. I mean, we have to remember that, you guys, we give them this, right? Like anytime we invest in that, we have given them this power. You can take it back.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you right then. I was like, so if we're choosing to give them power, and your statement is to give them power, then if we are changing language because people might be afraid of the word abolitionism or defunding, and we're watering this down, aren't we giving them more power?
Yes, we can't water it down. There's the choices to do that. I mean, defund the police bothers me in a way, and I'll tell you why. Say something like defund the police. I didn't understand what this meant. I thought that meant taking all the money away from the police, period. Everything, all right? I think there are ways to write immediately. I wish that it was that easy. Do you know what I mean? I wish something was that easy. Just, we pull all the money and everything gets handled. That's not what really happens. If they weren't getting paid, they're still going to show up to work. You guys get that, right?
Yeah.
They don't get the money, they're still going to show up. Their guns with their shit, you know what I mean? So I think the idea is like, we have to start at the very root of what this is and realize that it's broken. You know what I mean? Like you can't fix it. It's broken. It has to be reimagined into something else. We can't keep taking the same mashed up thing, putting a Band-Aid on it, smoothing it over and calling it a shiny new object. You know what I mean? It has to be ripped out and taken away. And I don't know how to do that. You know what I mean? I don't have all the answers. I just think that until we realize that like there's something she said when she was talking earlier about taking over that bridge, right? Understanding that she had the power to cause $3 million of damage in a couple hours. Like we can effectively, if we ever actually all got along, which is not what they want, but if we ever got along long enough to like figure it out, we could very effectively take this away from them. You know what I mean? They serve at our behest. They should be taken out of that servitude unless they're actually doing real service. All right, they're not doing service of any sort. You know, so I think that like until we're talking about reimagining what like this whole thing looks like, I love the idea of reimagining safety. You know, it's finding other ways to make our place safe. We're not like we got to quit living in this model that we feel like there's this inherent horrible thing gonna happen to us the second the police leave. It's not what happens, right? It's like we think what like gangs of marauders are waiting on the weights, just going, as soon as these blue cars go, we got them, you guys. It doesn't happen like that.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to give our other panelists a chance to respond
Sorry.
as well. Yeah, thank you.
Well, one thought along the lines of your question, and you know, Miriam Cava talks about a process of making police obsolete. So, you know, she's talking about abolition. It's, you know, you take in this till we free us, she talks about, you know, if we take 50% of the police budget and put it into community programs and that sort of thing, like crime goes down and the need for police goes down and then we don't need police. When Amber was talking about the pretextual stops, that's police characterize traffic stops as like, if not the, I think it's the most dangerous interaction that police say that they have. So if they're not doing that, then that's keeping them safe as well, which I think maybe was speaking to your question, or it's a, you know, a way to frame that. If they're not responding to mental health calls, which they're not trained for, you know, keeps them safe also.
Yeah, I mean, I was also just meaning like systemically, how is it harming our society and the people in those jobs to have people who are trained to inflict harm?
Yeah, and then, I mean, they also have high rates of alcoholism and domestic violence within policing, and they have support available, but they won't take support, mental health support, because you know, they're supposed to be tough and all of that stuff. So yeah, it perpetuates that cycle, because then the violence on the street, they take home and all that, and then it just amplifies.
One of the things that harms the officers in LEAP, you know, that I keep referring to, law enforcement action partnerships with all police. One of the things they continue to point out is when you give us bad policy to enforce, it hurts us, it hurts the community, it hurts our relationship with the community. So for example, let's say I am a police officer and I go into policing because I really have some sense of civic duty and I'm hoping to serve some higher purpose. I hear people say this all the time, and I don't want to say that they're all just being frauds, that none of them have any good faith. I'm going to assume that some have some good faith and are going in wanting to serve their community. Let's assume that for a second, okay? And they go into the job and they want to do, you know, they want to improve the life chances of people in the communities that they grew up in. A lot of them, I'm talking to Black officers now, were from poor communities, going back to those communities saying, I want to improve the conditions and life chances of people in my community. Okay, and then what are they given to do? What policies are they given to enforce? For example, a lot of them are told that irrespective of what you want to do, you have to bust kids for joints. If a kid has a joint in his or her pocket or purse, you have to bust them for that joint, put them in the system, you know, set them back in their life's, you know, chances. They're now having a hard time renting an apartment, getting a job because of that joint that you busted them for. And now out here in California, I can go in any direction 600 yards and find a marijuana boutique, right? There's a boutique marijuana shop within 600 yards of any direction I go in. So all those years, think of all those years, 20, 30, 40 years, cops were busting kids, ruining their lives for something that we now see was totally unnecessary. That we are now, as a society, profiting from, bragging about the taxes coming from and all the rest. So the police officer was given a bad policy, and as a result of his or her having to enforce that bad policy, she created a reservoir of resentment between her and those kids in her community that she wanted to try to make their lives better of for no good reason. So starting off the top, we have to get rid of all these bad policies we give officers. The war on drugs is a bad policy. Houselessness, using police to solve houselessness is bad policy. Using police to address mental illness is bad policy. And getting rid of those bad policies will make the lives of the police officers and their sense of mission so much better.
I'll just add that I think that we have to hold police accountable for the bad decisions they make. Being a police officer is a bad decision. And also, when Jody was describing, why people decide to be police officers, this idea of service to that community, you can work at a nonprofit and do that. You can volunteer in your community for free and do that. You can work at a school and be a teacher and serve the community. Like this excuse of, I have this upper, this huge idea of serving my community and being a good force. You can do all those things without being a police officer. It's an excuse. And if we're actually gonna hold folks accountable, we should say that to them, because I do it all the time. This, I give back to the community, and you can do that without being a police officer. I've heard police officers tell me, I feed the homeless when I see them. I don't be out here just arresting anybody. I keep clothes in my car. I said, you can do those exact same things without being a police officer. The excuses they use to absolve themselves of the harm that they cause should not be forgiven. And I think that in that process, we just hold them accountable and call that out.
They could be civilian crisis responders, for instance. Yeah.
What about requiring every police officer for 3 days a week to be unarmed? It wouldn't be that one officer was permanently disarmed, and it wouldn't be that they were disarmed all the time, but they would have to have the majority of their time without a gun.
Well, this will have to be our final question. What do our panelists think of this suggestion?
What would that serve? I don't understand the.
I think that if officers realized that they didn't have lethal force at their disposal, they would learn to deal with situations in a different way. And then even that percentage of the time when they did, they might be less likely to resort to it.
I don't think it makes sense because police officers kill folks without guns all the time. They've tased people to death. They've choked someone to death. They put their knee on them and they died. So I think adding in this idea of not having a gun for a period of time makes them have to have these other resources to use isn't realistic because they have de-escalation tools. In Memphis, the Memphis Police Department has over 100 hours more training than any other police department in the state of Tennessee, where they go over de-escalation training, mental health, they do all of these things. They still don't use any of those skills. And so saying that we're just gonna take a gun away from them for a few days and make them have to use those skills, I don't think it's realistic because they already aren't using them. And when they're forced to use them, they don't use them either.
I mean, I'd obviously include the taser in that ban.
I think also, what Dr. Armour mentioned in the film, Reimagining Safety, is also that, in his very long and extensive career, he's found that reforms have not worked over decades.
It's not just the arming though, it's the mindset, it's the training, it's, and I didn't know that about Memphis. On average, police departments across the United States spend 60 hours on firearms training in the academy and only 8 hours on de-escalation, which usually comes at the end in like role-playing exercises and things like that. And then once they get on the street, the way that you prove yourself to your fellow cops is by getting in fights, making arrests, hassling people. You know, so it's all, and, you know, Jody was talking about the warrior cop mentality. So it's all like, and then they get drilled in, your one job is to go home to your family at the end of the night. You know, so it just perpetuates violence, and Alex Vitale said this in the film, you know, whether they're armed or not, at the root of everything is violence.
Yeah.
You know, and so if they don't have a gun or a taser or whatever, like they're still harassing people, locking people up, getting in fights, calling their partners who are armed. You know, there's not really a way to make it any better, you know, inside with that system, with what exists.
And I think the real power in police is their presence. Their presence alone is violence. So trying to say that we're gonna remove things that we think will make them less violent isn't realistic. The only way to do that is to remove police.
Reduce their footprint, exactly. Reduce their footprint, reduce the number of things they are authorized to intervene in. Take them out of traffic stops, as Amber was saying. We've seen over and over, the data shows it. When you take police out of traffic stops, traffic fatalities do not go up, crime does not go up. So these pretextual stops are just there as fishing expeditions. And one of the reasons they do it, you got to understand why police a lot of times are doing things they don't need to be doing. The other studies show that at most 7%, a lot of times I've seen studies 5 to 7% at most of police officers' time is used responding to any kind of incident involving a crime of violence or any other kind of serious crime. At most 7%, I've heard is as low as 4 to 5%. That means if, let's say we're 7%, 93% of their time, they're just sitting around on their hands then, right? And they're making, here in LA, they're making $200,000 a year starting salary to sit around on their hands with 93% of their time. So their employers, you know, the officers who are running the show and the unions know that they have to somehow justify those bloated salaries. So we got to give them something to do. What are they going to do? We'll give them traffic stops. We'll give them other kinds of things to do because 93% of their time they're sitting around.
So, thank you. And to wrap things up, I would, you know, just, reiterate what we've heard today, is really that, while we are, taking a positive, inclusive, care, consent-based approach, we do need to remember that, at the core of policing is violence. And that's something for us to be realistic about. And so possibly the best approach is to be aware of that and to, try to make sure that police are being sent to those responses where they're required. Thank you, everyone, in the audience for attending today and for your generous time and participation. Thank you to our expert panelists. We're so grateful. And also for the scholars, Dr. Armour, Max, and Amber as well, who've joined us today. And of course, thank you to our event sponsors, the IU School of Public Health, Office of Public Policy Practice, a very strong supporter of these events. So thank you all. We hope you'll join the roundtable and continue these discussions in the future.
Thank you, Najla.
Thank you, Najla.
Thank you.